The Mexican War. The Mexican-American War was a conflict between Mexico and America over the annexation of Texas, which Mexico considered part of its territory. This war didn't set the stage for a civil war because the issue simply wasn't civil. The sectional split on the decision of going to war with Mexico was on a political stage of whether or not it was good for the nation as a whole, and therefore didn't affect or cause any civil disputes inside the nation.
The Compromise of 1850 was a total of 5 bills that were passed in the United States that was drafted by Henry Clay and the help of Stephen Douglas. This admitted California as a free state, allowed citizens of New Mexico and Utah territories to solve slavery issues alone. It also ended the slave trade in the District of Columbia and passed a new slave law to enforce that slaves that escape to a free state shall be taken back to his or her owner. This was not a primary cause of the Civil War, because these bills were passed to prevent the war, but also these bills benefited from the North more than the South. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe that helped lay out the groundwork for the Civil War. This was not a primary cause because the North nor the South was involved in making the book.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, designed by Stephen Douglas, created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, which opened new lands for settlement. The act allowed white male settlers in those territories to determine through popular sovereignty whether or not slavery would be allowed within each territory. Unfortunately, the Kansas-Nebraska Act did lead to a civil war inside of Kansas. But because popular sovereignty was not a concept used in all the states and territories, the problem of a flood of pro- and anti-slavery settlers didn't affect the rest of the nation, therefore couldn't lead to a larger scale civil war. The Dred Scott Decision. Dred Scott was a slave who sought citizenship through the American legal system, and whose case eventually ended up in the Supreme Court. The famous Dred Scott decision in 1857 denied his request, stating that no person with African blood could become a U.S. citizen. Besides denying citizenship for African Americans, it also overturned the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which restricted slavery in certain territories, when the court declared this compromise unconstitutional. This did not become a reason for the Civil War because although the North was mortified by the sectional influence at the Supreme Court level, the case alone was not large enough to affect the North in ways that could make them want to retaliate on the South. The North's only real response was the resolutions made in New York.
John Brown's raid was a slave revolt in Virginia started by a white abolitionist, John Brown. This was not the primary cause of the Civil War because the revolt was primarily an issue in the South and did not affect the North.
The election of 1860. The election of 1860 was a very divided, sectionally influenced event. At the time of the election, the nation was already divided into 4 different parties that hosted candidates. The Constitutional Union, who wanted to avoid the sectionism of the issue of slavery, the Republican Party, who were anti-slavery activists, the Democratic Party, who was large on popular sovereignty, and the Southern Democratic Party, who was largely pro-slavery. The election was won by Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party candidate. The biggest issue of this election is that the Republican Party was able to push Lincoln through and secure a majority of the electoral votes without a single vote from a Southern state. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on 10 Southern state ballots. The North's ability to push Lincoln through was perceived as a threat by the South. The South began to worry that they didn't have any political influence and would soon become a political minority. The South was also outraged because they believed Lincoln would abolish slavery since he ran upon the anti-slavery Republican platform. Since the abolishing of slavery would have ruined the Southern states' economies, the South was very worried. 11 Southern states decided to secede from the Union over time, 7 of them before Lincoln's inauguration. This alone had a big enough impact to set the stage for the Civil War, as it finally meant that it really had become North versus South at the creation of the Confederacy. The first attack that really sealed the beginning of the Civil War was an attack from the Confederacy at Fort Sumter at a harbor in South Carolina where both the Union and the Confederacy claimed the land.